the best of the week on Relevant Radio.
I logged on to X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, and one of the leading trending hashtags from the last couple of days has been Trans Day of Remembrance. Now, the Human Rights Campaign is claiming all kinds of crazy details in which they're trying to push forward this campaign. But what's really interesting is to follow the social media narrative. This is a Trans Day of Remembrance where the topic is swinging in both directions. And let me be clear when I say there are a lot of people who are championing a pro-LGBTQ agenda. I'm seeing this swing of people saying, no, let's set the record straight. Number one, I'm not okay with a transgender agenda that's trying to impact my children and it's causing mental health confusion for children. And also, let's set the record straight and actually remember these kids and young people in the prime of their life as young adults who are struggling with a so-called transgender identity and who are committing suicide or who are dealing with such severe mental health issues not addressed that we are seeing them behind the leading and most common school shootings and massacres of late. And I will share with you some of this because this is pretty significant that almost every single shooting that we have come across in the last couple of years, and I'm going to name 6 specific ones, there has been some trans or bi identity that the person who killed all of these kids, all these adults, went into the schools that this person was struggling with. And so what does it show? It shows a theme among many others when it comes to school shootings of young people who are struggling with their identity. And so when I see this hashtag, Trans Day of Remembrance, what I see is a tidal wave on social media of people saying, no, actually, people who are struggling with transgenderism, they are struggling with a mental health crisis. And I think this is something we're not speaking enough of. We're going to debunk the myth that if you don't transition into a new transgender identity that is not the same as your biological sex, that you'll commit suicide. This is a lie. And internationally, the mental health community is rejecting it. But for some reason, it's just in the United States, we're continuing to push a transgender identity, in particular upon minors, which is outrageous because studies show that up to 95% of kids who identify as transgender, and this is peer-reviewed, not faith-based research, up to 95% of kids who do not identify as trans, who are struggling to identify with their gender, with transgenderism, if they're not ushered into a transgender identity, they work it out. That's more than 9 out of 10 kids who struggle with gender. If you don't encourage them to identify and name as something else, they work it out on their own and they claim their biological real identity. That's in line with sound therapy and sound psychology that in the history of the mental health community has been what we do. For example, if we saw a person come to a mental health professional and this person said, I believe that I only have 3 limbs, 2 arms, 1 leg. But the person really had a second leg that was perfectly healthy and he could walk on. Well, the therapist would have the responsibility to give a sound guidance, sound care to help this person come to better understand their leg. And part of that therapeutic process with a professional would be helping to go back into the roots of that man's life to help him see, why is it that he's pretending like he doesn't have a second healthy leg? Why is he refusing to use it? Why is he on crutches only using 1 leg, even though the other leg works perfectly fine? And maybe what would happen is you would go back into his life and you would find, let's say perhaps that he served in the military and there was a major issue years ago where he was involved in battle and had an injury. And his leg's completely fine, but because he's shell shocked, he has some mental health challenges in terms of overcoming that wound and that time serving in the war, he is having a hard time accepting that he has a second leg. For some reason, there's some psychological stymie that's getting in the way of him embracing reality. The therapist would go deep back into his life to when he remembered he had another leg. How did you feel about that leg? What happened that made you feel like you didn't have, like, and the professionals would do the professional work, helping the person to come back into reality. See, this is what reality is. This is when I experienced it, or this is when I desired it, and this is how I realign myself with reality. That's what would happen if someone thought that they didn't have 4 limbs and that they were missing a leg. Now, a therapist would never go through and say, you know what, you're right. If you don't want to have that 4th limb, if you don't believe that your perfectly functioning and healthy leg functions, and you would feel happier if you didn't have it, sure, let's go ahead and take some drugs to prevent any circulation to that leg. Let's then maybe start to infect parts of the leg so that it doesn't function anymore. And then, you know what? Maybe we should amputate it. That's exactly what happens with any young person today who's a biological male and says, you know what? I think I identify as a woman. I think I'm a girl. The first visit to a therapist, do you know what happens? That therapist, without having any knowledge of past history, and we've seen this in the example of Abel Garcia, Chloe Cole, and I could go through the line naming many, Ollie London and others, who shared on that very first visit, after less than an hour together, that so-called therapeutic therapist professional gives a document that gives access to begin a transition with chemical hormones, therefore stymieing the proper functioning of the male-female hormones in the body. That would be like infecting your toe and then infecting your foot, because that person who rejects having 4 limbs and says he doesn't have a functioning leg, you would be saying, okay, well, let's start infecting it and making it stop work because you think you don't have it, so let's cause it not to work. Let's bring your reality into reality by using damaging drugs and maybe even bodily mutilation surgery to chop off your leg. This is how extreme the transgender movement is. Why is this relevant to the Trans Day of Remembrance? I'm trying to connect the dots that what's happening here is a real and very sad mental health crisis, a crisis of identity. And I have the utmost sorrow and concern and love for especially these young people who are floundering in a life saying, I don't know who I am, what I am. At the end of the day, you and I, as people of faith, know that this deep down inside is a crisis of faith, a crisis of family origins. However, that person who's struggling with their identity is in the midst of a chaotic world where girls are objectified to need to be perpetually hot and available, and boys say that they don't matter. They're being canceled left and right. It was interesting. I went to the aquarium this weekend, and my mind was blown because I saw 2 extremes with nowhere in the middle. Specifically girls. And I think this is relevant to girls because the largest group of people right now coming out as transgender are young females from high school to early 20s age. They are not just coming out as transgender, but they're coming out in groups, in cliques, in posses, girls together. You know, for some reason, girls have to go to the bathroom together. Apparently, they need to do this together as well. I don't get it, but here's the deal. It's a transgender craze. It's a mental health craze. Girls are rejecting what's happening. Now, how is this relevant to the aquarium this weekend? This weekend, here I am at the aquarium, and I see 2 extremes. I'm walking around looking at all of these teenage to college and a little beyond age girls who are either wearing huge, giant, baggy pants and the baggiest sweatshirt that you can't tell anything about their body. You can't see their figure. It's huge. It's droopy. It's ginormous. Okay? You cannot see anything of their body other than their head and hair that's sticking out. The girls have often usually terrible posture. Why? Because there's something about their bodies, something about their identity that they're deeply disassociated with. And they're rejecting it, or they're hiding it. That's how lacking in confidence in their female identity young girls are today. Now, there's no in between. The other extreme, I was just at the aquarium for an hour or 2, and this is all I see. On the other extreme, were girls wearing dresses that I'll just say left nothing to be desired, and I'm surprised I wasn't looking at underwear if there were any there to begin with. That's how far the extremes are. Girls who are either standing in their bodies as something that's meant to be perpetually hot and available, or girls who are saying, no, I reject that. Let's hide everything about my body to the point where let's just completely erase my body and say I'm not a girl. Girls are struggling, so are boys. So when there's this hashtag Trans Day of Remembrance going around on social media, I'm intrigued because I think people are catching on. And this is why you're hearing both sides. There are places such as the Human Rights Campaign that's really just smearing lies everywhere about the death of people, should I say men and women, especially young men and women who identify as transgender. And then you have the hordes of people who are telling the truth about a mental health crisis. Now, here's one that's to ponder. I'm going to give you 6 of the most recent school massacres where young men or young women came up and murdered tons of children. For example, first one more recently, March of this year. Person comes in Nashville and shoots, kills 6 people, including 3 9-year-olds. There was a transgender connection that's being covered up. Colorado Springs murderer identified as non-binary. Denver shooter identified as transgender. The Aberdeen murderer identified as transgender. Uvalde shooter identified as trans. I just gave you 6 examples. Now, mainstream media has actually punished people for releasing documents that had anything to do with some sort of trans non-binary identity. Even putting people on leave who are part of the investigation if somehow they think they might have been related to the release of the fact that data's coming out that some of these kids or very young 20-something-year-old individuals had some sort of confusion about their identity. All of these kids or young 20-year-olds who should be in the prime of their life are struggling with their identity, and they're going in with such a severe psychosis, such a severe mental health disorder that no one's helping to treat or address what's going on. And I'm just naming 6 of these. We could dig much deeper, but my heart is so heartbroken by the fact that these stories, when we look into the details that aren't being shared because it's being covered up by the mainstream media, by the pro-LGBTQ movement, include medication to transition, medication that's covering up a real crisis of health. There's a real victim crisis of bad therapy saying be transgender, be whatever you want. We don't talk about the lives of those friends and family members who are sorrowful because the therapy community, the medical community is going through and transitioning or saying you do you online. We need to see the suffering of men and women who are struggling with their identity and help with sound psychology, sound therapy that helps to align people with reality. We need to help young men and women to embrace reality, their male or, if they're female, identity. All of this is part of sound therapy historically, but for some reason we've gotten political about therapy, and it's fundamental to church teaching. God created us male and female, and we are called to embrace and come to a greater sense of discovery of our identity. So if you're a parent of a child, or if you have a friend struggling with their identity, you can see how they're dressing, how they're talking, what they're looking at. Help to align them with reality. Compliment that young girl's beauty. Build up that young man's strength. Be a mentor if you are someone of the same sex to help encourage and what it looks like to be a male. One way to be a male, one way to be a female. I believe in the power of prayer and I believe in the power of truth. That is Jesus Christ. So let's help set the record straight when it comes to days such as today of Trans Day of Remembrance. You can join me and listen on the Relevant Radio app to Trending with Timmerie live each weekday at 6 p.m. Central. Thanks for listening.